Hi everyone, Alice here. I want to cover some of the topics in chapter 22. That's what we'll be doing for adulthood, which is ages 25 to 65, pretty long span here, um, as a stage in the lifespan. So we'll just be using chapter 22, psychosocial development. So the psychological, emotional world, how it interacts with the social world for the adult. So I'll be picking out some number of the PowerPoints to talk to a little bit and go into a little more in depth. Probably this is the first of two screencasts. Sometimes people consider adulthood to be sort of a midlife crisis time, but that's not necessarily commonly believed by all developmental theorists. Sometimes we can think of it as a transition time, that there may be self-doubt or a reevaluation of a career or a shift in family responsibilities. And not to say that these things can't happen, but what brings on the crisis part might be more of how we handle those things, how over the lifespan we've developed different skills or personality traits that enable us to cope with different challenges that we have, because we'll have challenges throughout the lifespan and we'll have developed our ways of dealing with them over a great deal of time. So I want to talk about Eriksons stages a little bit here. I think you've probably heard of them, but let me introduce or reintroduce them. And remember this handout that we had for Piaget. Piaget is in here. We also have a table, it's table 2.1, compares some of Freud's psychosexual stages and then Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. So I focus in this class more on the ones adolescence and adulthood for Erikson. So Erikson developed these psychosocial stages, trying to say that our emotional and psychological development were being created or nurtured, and nature and nurture, throughout our entire life, and that there were challenges or crises that we had to get through at different times. So let's focus in on the adolescence. If you look at adolescence and go to the right, you'll see the column where it's Erikson's psychosocial tasks or crises. And he writes down identity versus role confusion. So that was in adolescence, where that emerging adolescent is looking for their identity, maybe asking, who am I? Trying out different personalities, trying out different ways of being in life, maybe different sexual, political, religious ideas, or they may have role confusion. So that was one task that Erikson identified. So if you look into adulthood, this is one thing that Erikson did really well. He came up with three different sort of tasks in adulthood, specifically the intimacy versus isolation, which is something that's really talked about pretty specifically for the emerging adult, that the emerging adult ages 18 to 24 often is seeking companionship, love, friendship, or they may feel isolated. Now, one thing to notice about Erikson's stages is that really people can go back and forth in some of these. I may have a significant relationship in emerging adulthood and then go through divorce in adulthood later and then reestablish a new relationship after that. So some of these things are more fluid maybe than what Erikson first designed them as. So there's intimacy versus isolation, as I say, more of an emerging adulthood theme. And then in this chapter, we'll have generativity versus stagnation. So that'll come up again in a little bit, but what is generativity versus stagnation? So let's go to this next slide. This outlines the Erikson stages of adulthood. Starts with identity versus role confusion, which I identified as being really something that we talk about with adolescence, but it's also considered in adulthood. So you'll consider these four stages. These are the last four stages of Erikson's, and you can see in there the third one, generativity versus stagnation. That's what we're really thinking about here in adulthood, ages 25 to 65. Generativity, think generate. So how is the adult contributing to society. Parenthood is a big thing. Different ways of parenting. Employment is a huge piece of the generativity. How are we going to contribute to future generations? Maybe a person does creative activities. And that sort of purpose and role is very helpful versus a feeling of stagnation, being more stuck, not necessarily contributing. So integrity versus despair will come up in the final stage of the lifespan that we look at. So Erikson is one major theorist. You want to kind of orient yourself with those 4 stages we just went through. Abraham Maslow is another developmental theorist. And you've probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm going to pause this and I'm going to go get a picture of the hierarchy of needs and talk to you about that. Okay, so here is a visual representation of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow was a humanistic psychologist, big in the 1950s, 1960s, and he built something that's been very, very useful for many psychologists and in many different applications for a long time. Some of you may have come across research papers, journal articles that use the hierarchy of needs to look at the needs of, say, addicts, elderly, um, anyone really, but they focus on different populations sometimes and try to think about is that population's needs being met. So for instance, let's say homeless population. If you look at the hierarchy of needs here on the screen, if you're trying to help a homeless person, the most basic need would be at the bottom of this pyramid that's in purple here. So physiological needs, their shelter, their food, being able to rest, etc., the different things that are identified on the bottom is where you would start to help that person. If these things are missing, it's very hard to build up through the rest of the pyramid, and that's part of Maslow's genius here and what he came up with. So he described 5 stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Security needs being second, belongingness and love, so having relationships and friends. This is transitioning from basic needs into more psychological needs. Esteem needs, feeling like this is where that generativity can kind of come in as well, so feeling of accomplishment, contributing to society. And the final one, the self-fulfillment needs, are around, you probably heard of self-actualization, where you achieve your full potential, you're the best that you could be. Maslow, in the very latest part of his life, the later part, he believed there might have even been a 6th part of the pyramid called self-transcendence, where we go beyond our own needs, our own self-actualization, and look out into society more so. How are we perhaps transcending ourselves and contributing to others, which interestingly sounds a little bit like the generativity versus stagnation as well. Okay, so here we are back to the PowerPoints. This is the slide that was around Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In this section, we're doing the Big 5, which is a personality inventory, and I have that in the week's material here for you to complete. And then I have a worksheet for you to get together with your podmates and respond to some questions, and those questions you can submit our next class period or so. I'll create a discussion or a file folder for you to contribute those to. But personality, remember we talked about temperament back when in infancy and early childhood, but now an individual has what we refer to more as personality. And the Big 5 is probably the most widely used personality inventory. You may have also heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And basically they're trying to take all the different personality traits out there and kind of group them into general areas and have people kind of be able to reflect on some responses to questions that then group them into these different areas and based on many, many traits, and perhaps gain some further understanding of ourselves and some deeper understanding of how to get along with other people. The worksheet and the work that I've assigned to you, I think, includes some information about geographical location, which is a really interesting way to think about the big five. My own personality, how does that fit maybe someplace geographically? Is it a small town, a large city? Is it East Coast, Midwest? Um, West Coast, south of the country? So these are some interesting questions that the worksheets are going to get into. So I'm not going to talk more about personality traits here because I think you have enough of that as you go along with the worksheet. Okay, we will talk briefly about romantic partners, very briefly, because again, we've visited this in the past around marrying trends. So what are the trends of marriage? Are there more marriages? Are there fewer? We already talked about that, but what are some of the alternatives to marriage that people have been using? This chart gives a really quick overview of percentage of US adults who married by their birth year. So if you look at if a person was born before 1940, that's the tall blue column all the way on the left there, then the vast majority of those people, I would say that's like 96% on this chart, maybe 97%, were married. Contrast that to born between the years 1970 and 1980, we see a significant shift. It's more like maybe 78% of the adults are marrying. So not everyone is finding that marriage is the path that they want to go down. They're able to ask that question. So what are they doing instead? As we talked about, even with emerging adult, there's more putting off of the marriage, and there's the serial monogamy. We talked about here with, well, oh, I had to remind myself I don't want to get into the marriage trends too much again. I know that you've already done some work on that. So I will move to what this slide is talking about, which is another interesting kind of way of people being together that maybe you haven't heard of before. LAT, so living apart together. So these are actually either they're partners, they may be married, but they're long-term committed partnerships where the people are living apart. So it's kind of another interesting way that that relationships are maintained. Gay and lesbian partnerships and marriages becoming another piece of what's going on in our society for other ways of imagining partnerships. If a couple does choose to get married, for whatever that means to them, marriage has shifted a lot in what it means to the couples who may choose it. What is that kind of marital happiness, and how long does it last? A lot of people ask that. You've heard about the honeymoon time just after the marriage. And typically the marriage will maintain its happiness. There sometimes can be difficult years with the children, especially teens going through a lot of transition. So working on how to work really positively with teens and adolescents is an important component of the family's happiness and the couple's happiness. And then data says that when the children get to be on their own, they're trying college or they're trying work life, that can be another time, an uptick of happiness in the couple's relationship. And of course, this is very individual. It could be different from one couple to another, but sometimes the data shows that there can be another spike in happiness there. Divorce is another topic that comes up. I only touch on it very briefly. I'd like you to go ahead and read the slide. I'm going to have to cut this and move to the next screencast. Thank you.